September 52 BC. The plains and plateaus of Gaul simmered under the late summer sun. Smoke still rose from scorched fields, the remnants of Vercingetorix' scorched earth campaign. 80,000 Gauls, warriors of every tribe, stood within the hill fort of Alesia, their banners snapping in the wind. Outside, 30,000 Romans, disciplined, relentless, and led by Julius Caesar, began a siege that would determine the fate of an entire people. This was more than a battle. It was a collision of worlds, the proud, heroic traditions of the Celtic tribes clashing against the industrial precision and engineering might of the late Roman Republic. For Caesar, victory meant survival, political, personal, and military. For Vercingetorix, failure meant annihilation, not just of his army, but of Gaul itself. Numbers alone cannot capture the terror of what unfolded. The Romans were outnumbered, yes, but they were masters of strategy, logistics, and psychological warfare. The Gauls, trapped on their plateau, were forced to confront not just an enemy in front, but the relentless march of Roman ingenuity closing in on all sides. Alesia would test leadership, courage, and the limits of endurance in ways few had ever seen. Before this confrontation, the balance of power in Gaul had already shifted. The death of Crassus in the east left Caesar isolated politically, while resentment across the tribes festered under the weight of Roman taxation and brutal reprisals. Into this storm stepped Vercingetorix, a young Arvernian noble with a vision: unify Gaul, resist Rome, and exploit every advantage of terrain, timing, and the warrior's code. Earlier in the campaign, Caesar had faltered at Gergovia, overextending his legions and suffering humiliating losses. 46 centurions fell. The aura of Roman invincibility cracked, and crucial allies defected. Yet in retreat, Caesar displayed the adaptability that would define him. Germanic cavalry mercenaries, fierce and disciplined, routed the Gallic horsemen near the Vigian, restoring confidence and forcing Vercingetorix to retreat to Alesia, the natural fortress he believed would be his salvation. But Alesia, high on its limestone plateau, was a double-edged sword. The fortifications and steep slopes promised defence, yet isolation meant that once the Romans encircled the hill, escape would be impossible. Caesar saw the trap and transformed it into a stage for one of the most audacious engineering feats in history. Within days, his legions constructed not one, but two massive lines of fortifications, an inner wall to contain the besieged, and an outer wall to repel the incoming relief army. Towers, trenches, sharpened stakes, and hidden obstacles turned the ground before the Romans into a deadly labyrinth. Inside Alesia, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Grain ran low. Civilians, women, children, and the elderly of the Mandubii tribe were expelled to starve in the open, a grim calculus designed to demoralize the defenders. Outside, the distant dust cloud of the approaching Gallic relief force signaled that Caesar's gamble had escalated into a perilous two-front confrontation. The stage was set. Two massive armies separated by earthworks and ditches, both poised for annihilation, each relying on discipline, courage, and sheer ingenuity to survive. The crucible of Gaul had begun, not with a clash of swords, but with a test of minds, strategy, and endurance that would decide the fate of a continent. A tension hung in the air over Gaul, thick enough to choke. The tribes whispered in secret councils, their voices sharp with defiance. Rome, once the unstoppable hammer of the West, now showed cracks. The defeat of Crassus in the east had emboldened the restless Gallic leaders, and Caesar, stretched thin, could not afford missteps. From the heart of the Arverni emerged a figure who would ignite this tinderbox: Vercingetorix. Young, calculating, and fearless, he grasped a truth few dared admit. Rome could not simply be beaten with brute force. To challenge the legions, he would need to turn the very land against them. Rivers, forests, and hills became weapons in his mind, each choice a chess move against the most disciplined army in history. The Gallic strategy was daring. Deny the Roman sustenance, draw them into traps, force them into exhaustion. Villages were abandoned, fields set aflame, and cattle driven away. Every scorched mile slowed Caesar, frayed his soldiers, and gnawed at the veneer of invincibility. Yet Caesar's genius lay not only in command but in adaptability. He pressed on, forcing confrontations when he could, probing defences and testing loyalties. At Gergovia, the clash of wills became tangible. Roman legions found themselves repelled atop the steep Gallic fortifications. Losses mounted, morale wavered, and the political alliances Caesar relied upon began to falter. It was a rare and bitter lesson. The Gauls, when united, could resist Rome's might. Vercingetorix then made his decisive move, retreating to the plateau of Alesia, a fortress naturally sculpted for defence. From this vantage he could observe every approach, every Roman manoeuvre, while awaiting reinforcements from allied tribes. It was a bold gamble. The Gauls could force Caesar into a siege, yet the Romans, masters of engineering and relentless in persistence, could turn even the strongest position into a trap. Across the plains, tribal banners fluttered like fire, each warrior aware that the moment of reckoning was near. Opposite them, Roman standards stood unwavering, a testament to training forged in blood and iron. Every decision, every manoeuvre would ripple through the battlefield, deciding not only the fate of armies, but the destiny of Gaul itself. As the sun sank low, shadows stretched across the land, and a silent promise hung in the air. Soon the first spark of war would ignite, and nothing would remain the same. The morning air over Gaul crackled with tension, carrying the distant echo of drums and the metallic scent of sharpened weapons. On one side, the Gallic tribes had gathered, a living storm of warriors, each tribe bringing its own temperament and skill to the field. The Arverni infantry, stalwart and fierce, braced their shields like walls of stone. The Aedi cavalry, mounted on swift, agile steeds, hovered like hawks, ready to swoop. The Nervii, feared across the continent for their sudden, brutal charges, moved silently among the ranks, their eyes calculating, their muscles coiled. Each man, each tribe carried the weight of freedom and survival, not just for themselves, but for the soul of Gaul. Across the valley, 30,000 Romans stood in measured formation, polished armour glinting in the rising sun, their discipline forged over decades of conquest. Legionnaires marched in perfect alignment, centuries-old tactics drilled into muscle memory, each soldier attuned to the commands of his centurion. Siege engineers scurried, erecting towers and fortifications, anticipating the chaos that would erupt once battle commenced. This was a machine of war, precise and unyielding, built to crush any opposition that dared challenge Rome. The composition of forces was more than numbers, it was purpose. The Gauls relied on fierce individuality and tribal cohesion, a collection of warriors who could strike unpredictably, vanish into the forests and return where least expected. Romans relied on structure, coordination, and the terrifying weight of combined arms. Infantry, cavalry, and artillery moving in deadly synchrony. Each approach had its strengths and vulnerabilities, and the coming engagement would test them to the extreme. Weapons clashed in practice drills as tension built. Roman pilums were sharpened, ready to pierce shield and flesh alike. Gaulish swords, long and curved, glimmered with menace. Spears were fitted, shields polished, and formations rehearsed, every man knowing that failure meant death, not only his own but the potential destruction of his people. The battlefield itself was a silent participant, with rolling plains favouring Roman cohesion, and wooded patches offering the Gauls the cover to strike without warning. As commanders reviewed their lines, there was no hesitation. Decisions made now, where to place the cavalry, when to commit reserves, how to adapt to terrain, would echo in the lives of tens of thousands. For Caesar, every legionary was a calculated instrument, a thread in the fabric of his strategy. For Vercingetorix, every tribesman was a spark, capable of igniting chaos among the Roman ranks if wielded with precision. The armies were ready, the air thick with anticipation. Across the horizon, the sun rose higher, casting long shadows over the plains. Each banner, each standard, each soldier braced for the moment when strategy would collide with courage, and the true measure of discipline, endurance, and leadership would be revealed. The composition of forces was not just about preparation, it was the heartbeat of an impending storm that would engulf Gaul and define history. From these assembled armies, the first moves of the confrontation would emerge, subtle at first, a feint here, a probe there, but gradually escalating into a spectacle of ingenuity, bravery, and calculated risk. The stage was set for tactics to meet tenacity, for strategy to meet instinct, and for the fates of empires to hang in the balance. The limestone cliffs of Alesia rose like a fortress forged by the earth itself, jagged ridges cutting the sky, rivers snaking through valleys below, and woods clinging to steep slopes. Every contour, every natural obstacle would become a weapon, a trap, or a refuge. For Vercingetorix, this plateau was salvation. For Caesar, it was a challenge demanding audacity, ingenuity, and the ruthless precision of Roman engineering. Alesia was more than a hill, it was a crucible of terrain, geography, and strategy. From the summit, the surrounding plains stretched for miles, offering both observation and exposure. Any misstep in maneuver or placement could spell disaster. Streams that seemed tranquil in summer could swell with autumn rains. Cliffs that appeared insurmountable could be scaled with ropes and determination, and forests could conceal ambushes or hide the enemy's retreat. The Romans would see the challenge not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity. Every slope, every ravine, every curve in the river could be transformed into part of a larger system of containment. Walls, trenches, and fortified camps aligned with the natural contours of the land. In the coming days, these features would shape the siege, dictating movement, supply, and survival. As the sun rose over the plateau, shadows traced the ridges, hinting at the dangers and possibilities lying in wait. Alesia's geography was not passive. It was a player in the unfolding drama, testing leadership, skill, and resolve. And as both armies prepared, it was clear the land itself would demand strategy, courage, and sacrifice before any sword was drawn. Dawn broke over Alesia with a brittle chill, the limestone cliffs catching the first light as if burning. The battlefield sprawled beneath, a natural amphitheatre where history would be decided. Caesar's legions, 30,000 strong, formed in precise lines, each cohort a living machine honed by years of relentless drilling. Shields interlocked, peeler ready, standards snapping in the wind. Discipline was their weapon, and every man knew that hesitation here meant death. Opposite, 80,000 Gauls surged with chaotic purpose. Tribal banners, colours clashing like fire against the pale stone, marked units that were less uniform but no less deadly. The Arverni infantry braced like walls of iron, their spears angled for shock impact. Aedui cavalry spread across the flanks, swift, relentless, ready to strike wherever Roman formation weakened. The Nervi, silent and deadly, lurked among hills and forests, their sudden charges capable of piercing the heart of even the most disciplined legion. Each tribe brought its own strategy, its own temperament, its own vengeance. Caesar's genius lay not just in numbers, but in geometry and positioning. Trenches and fortifications ran like veins through the Roman encampment, earthworks sculpted to dictate every enemy move, towers overlooked every approach, giving archers and ballistae a deadly vantage. Each legionary knew his role: hold the line, cover the flanks, anticipate the enemy. The Romans were not just an army. They were a living, thinking organism capable of adapting as one mind across 30,000 bodies. The Gauls, fierce and unpredictable, relied on mobility and audacity. Cavalry would probe, skirmishers would harry, infantry would strike where cohesion faltered. Leadership was decentralized, but passion and desperation amplified every command. They hoped to exploit terrain, to use the cliffs, the forest, and every hillock to their advantage, attempting to fracture the Roman precision with sudden, violent assaults. Between these two forces, the battlefield was a chessboard of possibility. Every hill, every ditch, every path carried potential, either for domination or annihilation. As the sun climbed, Roman formations tightened, Gallic banners flickered in the breeze, and a tense silence fell. For both sides, the coming hours would not be about numbers alone, but timing, discipline, and nerve. The first moves would test not just soldiers, but commanders, their ability to read the land, anticipate the enemy, and bend chaos into strategy. In this crucible of rock and soil, every decision could tip the scales, and the fate of Gaul balanced on the edge of a blade. Caesar's mind moved faster than any soldier could march. As the Gallic tribes prepared their first charges, the Romans began a feat that would define siegecraft for centuries. 2 lines of fortifications, one to contain the besieged, another to repel the approaching relief army, rose from the limestone plateau like a steel and earth barrier against fate itself. Trenches deep enough to swallow men, stakes sharpened to a point, hidden pitfalls and towers bristling with archers transformed the terrain into a labyrinth of death. Every legionary was a craftsman of war, each maneuver calculated. Earth, timber and sweat became weapons. Night and day the soldiers laboured, the rhythm of hammers and shovels echoing like drums of impending doom. Every obstacle had purpose, to slow, trap or impale. Every tower commanded a vantage from which Roman eyes and arrows could dominate the plateau and surrounding plains. The Gallic warriors watched from Alesia, their fury tempered by awe. They understood that no frontal assault could breach this wall, not without catastrophic loss, and yet they could not simply wait. Vercingetorix paced the ramparts, calculating, desperate, aware that the trap was closing even as he planned escape. Every move by Caesar was designed to suffocate initiative, to turn courage into chaos and stamina into surrender. Caesar's engineers did not stop at fortifications. Siege engines, catapults and ballistae were positioned to strike with precision. Ramparts were reinforced with angled barriers designed to funnel the enemy into kill zones. Supply lines were shielded, camps fortified, every measure anticipating both defence and offence. It was a war of engineering as much as of men, a demonstration that in Roman hands, order could become as lethal as swords and spears. From the slopes, scouts observed the labour with growing anxiety. The Romans were not just constructing defences, they were creating a strategic ecosystem, one that would trap, exhaust and annihilate Gaul's finest. For Vercingetorix, each day passed was a tightening noose. For Caesar, each wall and ditch was a calculated heartbeat, a mechanism turning the chaos of war into something he could command. By the time the sun rose high, the first sparks of confrontation would meet a fortress that was as much a weapon as the legions themselves. The battlefield had shifted. It was no longer just about courage or numbers, but engineering, foresight and the cold calculus of survival. The die had been cast. The stage for the crucible of Gaul was complete, and the first true test of endurance and ingenuity was about to begin. The air inside Alesia was thick with fear, smoke, and the scent of desperation. Grain stores had dwindled, animals had been driven away, and the cries of the starving, men, women, children, echoed against stone walls. Vercingetorix fortress, once a symbol of hope, was transforming into a prison. Hunger gnawed at the spirit of the defenders as fiercely as the Roman arrows and siege engines that now encircled them. Every day, the moral fabric of the tribes was tested. Leaders struggled to maintain order, families clung to dwindling rations, warriors fought not just Romans, but the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. Each decision carried unbearable weight: send the weak to die outside the fortifications, ration the last scraps of grain, or attempt sorties against the Romans that were certain death. Survival demanded impossible choices, and every choice left a scar. Outside, Caesar's legions watched with a detached precision. The Romans understood the power of attrition. The fortifications they had built were more than walls. They were instruments of psychological warfare. Every day that passed without a successful Gallic sally deepened despair inside the plateau. Fear, hunger, and frustration began to erode the unity that Vercingetorix had so painstakingly forged. Despite this, the Gauls resisted. Small sorties tested the Roman lines, scouts slipped through hidden paths, and messages were sent to rally allies for relief. Courage remained, but it was stretched thin across every man and woman clinging to hope. And yet, even hope was beginning to feel like a luxury they could not afford. As the days lengthened and the sun beat down on the encircled fortress, the psychological weight of siege became tangible. The defenders were not just fighting Romans, they were fighting themselves, the limits of human endurance, and the creeping despair that gnawed at loyalty and morale. Each shadowed corridor, each empty granary, became a testament to the moral abyss into which they had been forced. The stage was set for the next harrowing act. the arrival of the Gallic relief army. Outside, the dust clouds on the horizon signalled that fate was far from decided, that desperation would soon collide with the reinforcements in a confrontation that could decide the destiny of Gaul. Inside Alesia, hunger and despair had already begun their silent, ruthless siege, and nothing about the coming storm would offer mercy. The first signs were subtle, a distant shimmer on the horizon, dust clouds rising like ghosts over the plains. For the beleaguered defenders of Alesia, hope flared and faltered in the same breath. Word spread quickly. The Gallic relief army, thousands strong, was advancing. Warriors leaned against walls, straining eyes toward the horizon, hearts hammering with anticipation and fear. This was no ordinary force. It was a coalition of tribes, united by desperation and vengeance, each contingent bringing its own fighting style, its own fierce reputation. Cavalry thundered across the plains, drummers beat a relentless rhythm, and archers moved like shadows through the lines. Vercingetorix, standing atop the ramparts, saw not just reinforcements, but the fragile chance to turn the siege into a battle that could shake the very foundations of Roman ambition. Caesar, ever vigilant, observed the distant movement with the calm of a predator. He knew that the success of his double-line fortifications would be tested like never before. The Romans braced themselves for the storm, sharpening stakes, adjusting towers, and preparing contingencies for every conceivable maneuver. Discipline would face its ultimate trial against the fury and numbers of Gaul united. The relief army pressed closer. From the ramparts, the defenders could see the undulating mass of warriors stretching across the horizon, banners snapping in the wind, the ground trembling beneath the weight of thousands of charging feet. Every man and woman in Alesia understood what this meant. Victory might still be snatched from the jaws of starvation, but the coming clash would demand courage, cunning, and endurance beyond imagination. As the sun climbed higher, the two forces approached the inevitable collision. The Gallic relief army was a living wall of motion, determination, and fury. The Romans, encircled but resolute, relied on calculation, engineering, and the unbreakable cohesion of centuries-old discipline. Each side would push, probe, and test the other, the outcome balanced on a razor's edge. In the shadow of Alesia, the stage was set. The desperate hope of the besieged met the relentless precision of the besiegers, while the relief army's thunderous advance promised a climax that would decide not just the siege, but the destiny of Gaul itself. The air trembled with anticipation, and the horizon itself seemed to hold its breath for the coming storm. The plains around Alesia shook with the roar of battle, the earth trembling beneath the clash of thousands of warriors. Dust, smoke, and the metallic scent of blood mingled in the air as the Gallic relief army collided with the outer Roman fortifications. Spears shattered, shields splintered, and the disciplined lines of Roman legionaries held, just barely, against the relentless surge. Inside the walls, Vercingetorix watched the chaos unfold, every movement a test of timing and courage. He knew that the moment of truth had arrived. If the relief force could breach Caesar's outer fortifications, the siege could be reversed, and Gaul might be saved. Yet the Romans, anticipating every angle, had built not just walls, but traps, obstacles, and deadly kill zones. Every charge met a counter. Every push was met with steel and strategy. For hours, the battlefield became a furnace of ingenuity and fury. The Gauls, united in purpose, hurled themselves against the Romans with desperation born of survival. Roman legions responded with precision and discipline, closing gaps, reinforcing weak points, and exploiting every misstep. Cavalry clashed, archers rained fire from behind fortifications, and engineers triggered hidden defences that turned the plain into a deadly labyrinth. Yet even amid the thunder of battle, human determination shaped the outcome. Men fought not as individuals, but as embodiments of the legacies they carried, Romans defending the honour of their republic, Gauls defending their homeland and way of life. Vercingetorix, leading from the heart of the fortress, inspired courage even as hunger gnawed at the defenders. On the Roman side, Caesar orchestrated movements with unyielding focus, reading the battlefield like a living map, anticipating the Gallic countermoves before they unfolded. As the sun sank low, the tide finally turned. The outer relief force faltered against the disciplined might of Roman formations. The inner defenders, starving but unbroken, could no longer sustain hope of a breakout. Vercingetorix made the fateful decision to surrender, not out of defeat in spirit, but because the calculus of survival demanded it. The double encirclement had worked, the Romans' engineering and strategy proving decisive against even the most fervent resistance. The clash of arms subsided, leaving silence that rang louder than any battle cry. Gaul had been tested in fire and steel, and Rome had emerged triumphant, not through sheer numbers, but through discipline, ingenuity, and the ruthless calculus of war. The consequences would echo across the continent. One man's vision of unity humbled, a people subjugated, and a commander's legend solidified in the annals of history. The siege of Alesia was over, yet its lessons endured. The fusion of strategy, engineering, and psychological insight could bend even the fiercest resistance. Caesar's triumph would shape the destiny of Gaul, but the spirit of defiance that had risen in its tribes would never be forgotten. In the ashes of Alesia, the crucible of war had forged history itself. The battlefield had fallen silent, yet the weight of history pressed down like the midday sun on Gaul. Vercingetorix, once the embodiment of hope and defiance, emerged from the fortress of Alesia. He rode alone, his armour battered, his standards lowered, the faces of his weary warriors etched with despair and exhaustion. Around him, the hill fort lay in ruins, its proud banners torn and tattered, a stark testament to the cost of resistance. Caesar awaited, not as a mere adversary, but as the arbiter of fate. The young Arvernian noble dismounted and knelt, a gesture heavy with both dignity and resignation. In that moment, the siege of Alesia transformed from a clash of armies into a symbol of subjugation and political theatre. For Caesar, the surrender was not merely military, it was a statement to Rome, to the provinces, and to history itself. The Gauls, 1,000 strong, were marched under watchful Roman eyes, their spirit bruised but not entirely broken. Civilians, warriors, and allies alike confronted the bitter reality. The dream of a united Gaul had been shattered. Yet the memory of defiance would echo through generations, fueling the stories of heroism, strategy, and sacrifice. Vercingetorix's fate was sealed by Rome's political and martial code. He was paraded through the streets of the Eternal City, a living trophy of Roman supremacy. His captivity would last years, a silent witness to the power of Caesar and the inevitability of Roman authority. Finally, in 46 BC, he would meet the ultimate price, execution in the Circus Maximus, an end both tragic and emblematic of the cost of resistance against an empire that brooked no rivals. But even in defeat, Vercingetorix' legend endured. In the annals of Gaul and Rome alike, he became more than a man. He was a symbol. The young noble who dared to unite tribes, who challenged the might of the most disciplined army in history, whose tactics and courage forced the greatest general of his time to extraordinary lengths. His surrender marked not just the fall of a fortress, but the turning of an era, the quiet rise of Roman dominion over Gaul, and the enduring story of human resolve in the face of overwhelming power. History would remember Alesia not simply as a Roman victory, but as a crucible that tested courage, leadership, and the indomitable will to resist. In the end, Vercingetorix's surrender was both an ending and a beginning, the end of Gallic independence and the beginning of a legacy that would echo across centuries, a reminder that even in defeat greatness could endure. Centuries later, the fields of Alesia still whisper their secrets. Archaeologists, trowels in hand, trace the faint scars of fortifications, the echo of Roman ditches and the outlines of the inner and outer walls that once strangled the Gauls. Every mound of earth, every fragment of pottery, every weapon unearthed tells a story corroborated by Caesar's meticulous commentaries and the scattered voices of Gallic chroniclers. Historiography, however, is not simple. Roman accounts, polished and propagandistic, frame Caesar as the unparalleled strategist. the conqueror who crushed the unity of Gaul with skill and audacity. Gallic perspectives, though fragmentary, hint at the resilience, ingenuity, and indomitable spirit of tribes united under Vercingetorix. Scholars sift through bias, cross-referencing battle plans, logistical records, and material evidence to reconstruct the sequence of events with precision. Modern science, surveying, radiocarbon dating, and landscape analysis, has confirmed the scale and sophistication of the siege works. Archaeologists have mapped the double lines of circumvallation and contravallation, revealing how 30,000 Romans contained 80,000 Gauls, while simultaneously preparing for relief forces on the horizon. These discoveries transform Caesar's texts from tales of glory into verifiable strategy, engineering marvels, and logistical triumphs. Casualty estimates, once wildly speculative, are now grounded in forensic evidence. The human cost emerges not merely in numbers, but in the silent void left on the plateau. The scorched earth, the abandoned villages, the echoes of families uprooted, and the marks of siege and starvation etched into the land. Every excavation reveals the stakes of rebellion and conquest, the fragility of empires, and the resilience of those who dared oppose them. By examining both archaeological remains and written records, historians gain insight into more than just military maneuvers. They uncover the social, political, and psychological dimensions of the campaign, loyalty forged and tested, morale shattered and rebuilt, the interplay of fear and hope that dictated choices on both sides. The Siege of Alesia was more than a military engagement. It was a crucible of human ambition, endurance, and ingenuity, immortalized through stone, soil, and script. Ultimately, the legacy of Alesia is dual. It is at once a testament to Roman military genius and a memorial to the courage of the Gauls. Through archaeology and historiography, the past speaks, reminding us that history is never simply written. It is excavated, interpreted, and understood across centuries, layer by layer, battle by battle, human story by human story. The plains of Gaul were silent once more, yet the echoes of conflict lingered far beyond the limestone hills of Alesia. The siege had ended, but the lessons it left behind would shape the fate of empires. Rome, disciplined, relentless, and engineered for conquest, had demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of a centralized military machine. Vercingetorix and the united Gauls, though ultimately defeated, had revealed the raw power of local knowledge, unity, and unconventional tactics. Alesia stands as a study in asymmetry. One side relied on numbers, terrain, and improvisation, the other on structure, engineering, and the cold calculation of strategy. Victory did not merely belong to the strongest army, but to the one capable of exploiting both its strengths and its enemies' weaknesses. Here, the imbalance was not only martial, it was political, psychological, and social. Rome's empire could project power, logistics, and fear across continents, while Gaul's tribes depended on cohesion, speed, and the courage of individuals willing to risk everything for freedom. This asymmetry would echo throughout history. Empires rise on the pillars of organization, infrastructure, and disciplined leadership. Yet resistance, even when doomed to fail, exposes cracks, delays dominance, and forces adaptation. Caesar's campaigns in Gaul exemplified this duality. The might of Rome imposed order, yet it was constantly tested by the ingenuity, resilience, and unpredictability of those it sought to subdue. The legacy of Alesia, then, is not confined to a single battle or a single commander. It is a lens through which the mechanics of power and resistance can be understood. It shows how technological mastery, disciplined organization, and strategic foresight can collide with local knowledge, unity, and unyielding resolve. Empires are measured not only by the territories they conquer, but by the lessons carved into the land and memory of those who resist. In the quiet aftermath, Gaul would eventually be absorbed into Rome's ever-expanding dominion. Yet the story of Alesia endures. It is remembered not simply as a Roman victory, but as a moment when human ingenuity, courage, and the asymmetry between order and chaos converged to shape the course of history. The empire had won the day, but the struggle, the the brilliance and the audacity of the Gauls remained etched into memory, a testament to the enduring complexity of conquest and resistance.